Why would they be penalized for this? Why wouldn't they, again, when the patron saint state is majority Christian, why wouldn't the Christians there be getting some kind of special pass? I just don't understand that. Why punish the Christians for Islamic terror?
Recently, Tucker Carlson exposed the fact that Israel has always been and remains an apartheid state ever since its advent in 1948, and how this relates not only to the Palestinians living in Israel, in Gaza, and the West Bank, but also more and more in recent years when it comes to Christians living in Israel. So this is in the context of a conversation that he had with a nun that lived in that region for a long time. So let's get his take on this. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.
I'll just be totally blunt with you. Most Americans are aware that there's a system, something like what you just described.
Right.
But the pretext for it, the justification for it, is that there's a lot of Islamic terrorism. There are a couple intifadas. There are a lot of suicide bombings. And it's Islamic terror. And most Americans have been taught for 25 years that Islamic terror is a threat. And, there's some truth in that, of course. But so we assume that Christians would be getting an exemption from all this. Why would Christians who are not responsible for Christian terror, there's no such thing, why would they be penalized for this? Why wouldn't they, again, when the patron saint state is majority Christian, why wouldn't the Christians there be getting some kind of special pass? I just don't understand that. Why punish the Christians for Islamic terror?
Because I don't think it's Islamic terror that's taking place in the first place. I think we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion that this is a battle between Muslim and Jew, or that, constantly you heard after the October event was that Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. Even to this day, we hear it's Hamas,
Yes.
Hamas, Hamas. What is Hamas? Hamas are people who have had their homes taken from them, who, if they live in Gaza, have not been basically been in an open air prison for certainly the last 20 years going on. Even when the Israelis withdrew from Gaza, they didn't leave open borders. There was no freedom for people in Gaza to develop their economy. If I know people who wanted to try to go to school in America and couldn't get out of Gaza, had a Fulbright scholarship and weren't able to leave.
I mean, couldn't get out.
Israel didn't give them permission. So what kind of freedom is that?
And that's very common in Gaza. It's very rare that people can go into Green Line Israel from Gaza. And yeah, to be honest here, it seems like it's been an open-air prison more or less since 1967 when Israel gained that territory through warfare with Egypt. It was part of Egypt prior to that, and the West Bank was part of Jordan prior to that. And yeah, I mean, if I'm to half disagree with Tucker here, I would say that there is such thing as Christian terror if you consider, the neocon mantra and application of foreign policy around the world as being indicative of that. I don't think that there's anything Christian about that, but the people implementing that, some of them were Christian, not just Jews. That was people like Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and Lindsey Graham on top of, the Jews that push that kind of policy within the United States. So yeah, I mean, I think that the U.S. and Israel are great forces of terror, and that's what you're seeing play out here. And she's also right about Hamas. And you can say all those things she did about Hamas and still not excuse the violence and terrorism against innocents that weren't combatants. That's for sure. But nothing justifies the response that Israel's made in the 22 months since. Nothing gives them open license to slaughter women and children in Gaza, and you can just say Hamas, Hamas, Hamas over and over to justify it. I'm sorry, you can't. We're not believing that Israel has a right to defend itself, and that being the ultimate excuse that it can use until the end of time. That's over.
If you live in Gaza,
they couldn't even fly out.
No, and their airport had been bombed in 2000 and early on. 2000, there was an airport built soon after the Oslo Accords, but Israel has intervened many times in Gaza and little by little destroyed. When I first went there in 2002, after the second Intifada started, I remember saying to my mother back home, this is genocide, even that genocide by Chinese water torture. But now we're seeing genocide on steroids.
You're American, I should say.
Yes, I'm born in America. Yeah, lived in America. And so getting back to Hamas, so also the school I was at has 350 girls. It's in a town that's 98% Muslim. Though it has roots, I mean, it's the roots of where Bethany, where on our school grounds is a stone from the 6th century. This is where Christ met Martha at the resurrection. So we're talking about, and it's the road leading. There's still part of the road that existed when Christ walked during that time and would have seen Lazarus and Martha and Mary. Lazarus's tomb is down the road, right? And so permeated even with Palestinian Muslim culture is the sense that Christians lived here and they recognized Jesus as a prophet.
Yeah, and that was true prior to the Zionist experiment, the Grand Zionist Project that culminated in the creation of Israel by globalists at the UN through a resolution that was supported predominantly by the United States and Britain. It was people of all kinds that lived there. And, so many people just believe that there's always been violence in that region from the beginning of time, when the truth is, between the time of the Crusades, the end of the Crusades, and the creation of Israel, there actually wasn't that much violence in that region. Jews and Gentiles, Christians, Jews and Muslims mostly lived side by side. And that was true for something like 700 or 600 years in that interval. And you just get this excuse, it's always happened because of Muslim terrorism, but terrorism originated on the Jewish side, on the Israeli side, the Zionist side in the 1940s. And if you don't believe me, read up about the Stern Gang, otherwise known as Lehi, and the tactics they used, which actually did influence future Islamic terror, but it originated on the Zionist side.
So they respect him and so there's, I'm not saying that everything is perfect. You can't have divisions between, just like even with Christians. Some Christians might think we should have allow politics to be in the church or legislate Christian morality, and others would think totally different. So you can have sort of differences of opinion, if you will, and we can all live with each other between that. So with Muslim and Christian, they can have their differences, but overall, the Palestinian culture is infused with both. There.
So you were a nun in a majority Muslim town, a Christian nun,
yep,
in your habit, I assume.
And which also was to an advantage because pious Muslims are not jihadists, the ones that I know. I'm not saying other parts of the world that may be the case, but in Palestine, it's simply not the case, or Syria or Lebanon or Iraq. The Muslims that for the most part are, they've all grown up together.
And I got to say, that's my experience in the United States. I don't know anyone that ended up a jihadist. There's Muslims in my neighborhood. They're pretty peaceful people. Do I agree with them on religious tenets? Not many of them, actually. I mean, people say that, Islam is so similar to Christianity in so many ways, but actually it breaks in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to, the time after Jesus was born. But at the same time, that is most people's experience. And, for these people to be treated so hostilely by the ruling party, the Likud in Israel, and what they're doing in Gaza is just wrong, no matter who you are. And that's the point. If you're a Christian, you should believe that everyone's entitled to be able to at least hear the word. None of us are entitled of the glory of God. Jesus gave that to us despite our shortcomings. But he made it clear and open that the gospel's for the Jew and the Gentile. And, Saul hunted Christians to their deaths. He was a strict Pharisee, and he was presented, with the truth. He opened his eyes after being blinded on the road to Damascus. So sorry to wax theological at this point, but that is a core tenet of Christianity.
The Christians and the Muslims, and there's a certain amount of commonality and respect. And so me being dressed like this was just like many of the women there, right? So they kind of respected that. There's the same sort of conservative culture. There's the same sort of idea that we're both have some same basic values of compassion for our neighbor, of taking care of our families, and trying to live. They have their form of fasting and almsgiving, and it's actually very important to them. And I think the best parts of Islam come from its development from Christian ideas that Muhammad came to know. I'm sure of that. You can sense it.
This is a very different story from the one that we're told in the American media, that Christians are imperiled by Muslims in the Middle East.
They are not imperiled by Muslims in Palestine. That is an absolute fact.
They are now in Syria, though, where Jelani persecutes them, hunts them down, executes them, just like the Druze. And remember, Jelani is the one that Israel wanted to get into power because they wanted to take out Assad. And now the ruler of Syria is Jelani, a former al-Qaeda fighter. This was the most treasonous act of U.S. foreign policy in my lifetime, I think, when the United States aided ISIS and al-Qaeda to depose that regime. It didn't work, at the beginning stages in Obama's term when that money started flowing in, but it did culminate in his ascension in late December 2024. But, Christians are being persecuted there, and Israel wanted, that leader deposed, and look at the ramifications. You are seeing that in some places. It doesn't look like in this lady's experiences in Palestine, though.
And that's just simply not the case. And again, going back to my school, in our school, we had icons, which are part of the Orthodox tradition, pictures of saints and crosses in every classroom. No problem with that. I could show you a photograph, I can't now, but of the graduates of the latest high school graduation. And, they're embracing the nuns there. They're dressed actually in a more secular way. And it all
So a lot of
together.
your students were Muslim?
98%. The only Christian
of your students were Muslims?
Yeah. And about half the teachers during the time I was there, some Muslim, some Christian.
In a Christian school?
Yes. And actually that's all throughout Palestine. The Orthodox is relatively small. We do have schools in many of the Palestinian towns, but also Catholic schools, Lutheran schools. And most of the population, most of the students are Muslims.
That actually really blows my mind, that 98% of her students in a Christian school were Muslim. That's a narrative you never hear here. That's for sure. So if Tucker's mind is blown on that, so is mine. That's not something I ever would have thought or expected.
Huh. And the beautiful thing about where the great danger is, if the Christians continue to diminish, a key part of Palestinian society and within Israel as well, you go to Nazareth, you'll see many Catholic-run hospitals, schools. And so it's a fabric, it's a part of the whole character.
But I'm just still confused by the idea that the Christian population is declining under Israeli rule.
Yeah.
You would think just the opposite.
What gives them what I observed from my time in Israel and going back every year is that they do not want any Palestinians there. So the majority of Christians in Israel and Palestine are Palestinian. So they have to leave too.
This is true. They make it expressly difficult for Palestinians to move from Gaza or the West Bank into Green Line Israel. It happens, but it's extremely rare. There's a strict process through which you have to jump through a bunch of hoops to make this happen. A large amount of the populace has never been into Green Line Israel. And this has just been true for a long time. And it's been true since 2005, too, when they say the occupation ended, right? But by that, they meant they moved IDF forces from Gaza to the West Bank to expand those settlements, which they're still trying to do today in Syria and Lebanon, and still maintained a crackdown on everything that comes in. There's a blockade. They just imposed an aid blockade 3 months ago, by the way. People are essentially second-class citizens, don't have the same legal rights, don't have the same rights to sue and testify in court. If a dispute happens between an Israeli and a Palestinian, the conviction rate or the civil result is very much skewed in favor of the Israeli. And that's just the bottom tier of everything that goes into this apartheid regime.
What grieves me is that the Holocaust is a horrible, horrible thing that happened. People slaughtered fairly quickly. Sometimes the thought comes to me when I've driven between, there's a tunnel road that goes from Jerusalem to Bethlehem, and it's only for the settlers to go on down to the continued settlements that lead down further south in Israel to Hebron, or actually I shouldn't say Israel, into Palestine, other Palestinian territory. As you're going, that tunnel road has been carved out of land that belongs to people in Bethlehem and Bejala, which you're passing by on that tunnel road. So it's like a living death. How would you like to be a man? That was your grandfather's olive trees, but now it's controlled by Israel, and you're not even allowed to drive on that road.
So just think of that. This apartheid regime is reliant even on the level of banning you from driving on certain roads, even if you're not a Muslim Palestinian, even if you're a Christian Palestinian too. You know, the Christians that have died in Gaza since this thing began, those stories have basically been swept under the rug, but Israel has bombed more than one church, and something like 50 to 100 Christians have died there, according to many estimates. Justin Amash, the former congressman, had a close family member that still lived in Gaza, pulled out of the rubble, a young child. It's absolutely heartbreaking, but I had no idea that Christians were treated in a way that was, so similar in some ways as the Palestinians are. Getting her experiences and, things on the table is something that I don't think Americans would ever hear. So I have to applaud Tucker for covering it and her for sharing that story. But like I said, this has been an apartheid regime since the very start. I mean, it wasn't enough to kick Palestinians off their property as part of this UN partition plan that Zionists took far beyond that. Initially, it was going to be in the 47 resolution that the Palestinians would get something like 56% of the land, just because of this global entity said that, and the Palestinians would get something like 44%. But, there was a war that occurred over it, obviously. I mean, I think I would fight for my property if invaders came to take it through coercive means backed up by a globalist organization. And then it became something like 78% of the land were held then by the Zionists, and something like 22% of the land were held by the Palestinians. And it's essentially been that way. I mean, there's been wars every now and then, and the territory has shifted a little bit, especially after the 67 war, also called the 6-Day War. But that's been the case mostly throughout time. And every time there's been a two-state solution put on the table from the Palestinian side, the perspective is just starting at that 22%. That 22% could be the basis for a new Palestinian state. But even that, the Israeli government has rejected. They won't accept it, especially people like Netanyahu, who funded Hamas for over a decade, from 2012 even until the weeks just prior to October 7th, with the mentality that, hey, if we, the Israeli government, fund Hamas, they'll never get a Palestinian state because no one will want to negotiate with them, no one will want to take them seriously, and they'll destabilize the Palestinian authorities. It seems to be a strategy that's played out that way, but it implicates Netanyahu in this madness. I mean, he never has to explain his connections to Hamas, but yet they use that excuse, Hamas, to do what they're doing in Gaza. And it's murderous and it's genocidal. And that's where we're at. So let me know down below, do you agree with this? What do you think is the end game here? What is going to happen in Gaza? Are they really going to occupy it? And what is going to happen to Israel as a result of this? Will they still stand as a country with the backing of the United States, despite all the world being aligned against them? Let me know down below. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, also subscribe to Tucker. Appreciate this conversation. And please consider becoming a YouTube member. If you click the join button below, you can help support the channel. And as a gift for doing so, I'll give you access to all of my videos before they go live to the general public on my channel. And until I see you guys next time, no more war, no more debt, no more inflation, no more empire, and in Gaza, no more genocide. So take it easy, guys. I'll check you out in the next one. Peace out.